Good morning and welcome to our service. We are so glad that you chose to worship with us this morning. If it's your first time here, or whether you call Epicenter your church, we want to encourage you to take some time and fill out the connection card. In the bottom, you can fill out any prayer requests that you may have, and if it's confidential, you can drop it off at the black box right by the entrance. If it's not, feel free to drop it off as the offering plate goes by.
There are different ways to get connected with others here at Epicenter Church. This Saturday, we will have our Epicenter's Fine Dine, and we'll be heading over to Mosconi's in Ferndale. So make sure and get signed up, and we hope to see you there.
It's an amazing song.
Just kind of happened. Took about 10 minutes, I guess.
Bart, you didn't write this song in 10 minutes. It took a lifetime. How'd you do this?
You know, I've never told anybody my story. When I was 11 years old, life was tough.
Where's Mama?
She's gone. She don't want me no more. And she don't want you neither.
My dad was a monster, and I saw God transform him.
Another great way to get connected is to come to one of our movie nights. They happen monthly, and this month we are playing I Can Only Imagine. It's a great movie. If you haven't seen it, or if you just want to see it again, make sure and join us this coming Sunday. It's open to the whole family. And if you want to sign up at the entrance, that way we can better prepare for the event, and concessions will also be available.
Allow me to chisel them out of your life. Allow me to produce character where you keep focusing so much on your image.
Okay, but I was thinking.
Your thoughts are not my thoughts.
Okay, but if we went another way.
Your ways are not my ways.
Oh, I can't.
You can't what?
I can't be good.
That's your excuse. That's your excuse, is that you can't be good.
It's not an excuse. I can't.
Oh, my child. In the beginning, I said it was good. I made you good. Be good.
Yeah, but you and I both...
What?
Nothing.
No, what is it?
Nothing, okay? You wouldn't understand.
I, God of all the universe, wouldn't understand something one of my children has to say. Try me.
It's just, I let you down so many times, God.
No, my child. You were never holding me up. I hold you up with my victorious, righteous right hand, never the other way around. In this relationship, I hold you up.
Okay. And chisel away. But just be prepared for what you're going to find in there. Because I know who's inside there.
This last Wednesday, Allison, who was actually part of our student ministries program, and she's also part of the worship team, my wife and I stayed afterwards talking on Wednesday, and we're talking about phobias, fears that we have. And as we're talking about this, it became very obvious that we all have different fears, different phobias with critters and different reptiles, you know. And she shared hers, I shared mine. We gave each other ammunition as to how we could prank each other. So that's how we work. But, you know, we're talking about all these things that we're deathly terrified of, you know. And for me, one of the things that I'm absolutely terrified of are mice, which is crazy that a grown man could be afraid of something so small. But, you know, they just terrify me. And for her, she shared her phobia. And as we're talking about this, I realized that some of those things are pretty easy to acknowledge. I mean, you know, as I share these things, it's not hard for me to say I'm scared of a mouse. But when it comes to other things, we have a little bit more of a difficult time. So as I was preparing for this message, I was thinking, what are some of the things that we could possibly be scared of and that we would have a hard time acknowledging to others? And as I was thinking about this, I'm assuming that if I were to ask most people in this room, what is something that terrifies you and might even keep you up at night? What might actually create fear in you is the fact that maybe somebody will find out something from your past. Something that you've done a very great job at burying and hiding so that nobody ever finds it out. Because let's be honest, everybody likes to have a clear image. Everybody wants to be seen as the great person that they present to be. And as I thought about this, we start to create a fresh new start by suppressing, by trying to get rid of everything. And it takes a lot of effort. We're trying to hide our past so that nobody knows what happened in the past. And when we look at it this way, when it comes to our relationship with God, we treat it the same way. There are certain things that we assume we can do a great job at hiding from God. Or if not, we end up finding ourselves like Tommy from the Skid Guys in the opening video clip, where he says, you know what, just be careful, because I know who's in there. We find ourselves almost like Adam and Eve after the fall in the garden, where they're ashamed and hide their sin. They're trying to cover it up. And in our lives, we do the same thing. We're very good at trying to hide the things that might distance people from us because we don't want for anybody to know some of the things that we're not proud of doing. And at a point, we get to where we realize that what we're doing is wrong, but we still do it anyways. We distance ourselves. But I want you to understand a couple of things, which I think that everybody knows this. When it comes to our character, you can try to hide it from the people around you, but you can't hide it from God or the person that's in front of you in the mirror. And the issue is we do a fabulous job at trying to do that. I mean, our lives almost become an enigma. We're trying to figure out, okay, who is this person? Because what they're saying doesn't match up to what they're doing. It's a totally different person. So there's something that they're trying to hide. And we withhold details and information. You know, we'll say parts of the story, but we won't say the story in full because we're not wanting for people to see the real us. And you could withhold information from people, but you can't withhold the truth to the person that stares at you in the mirror every single time that you're in front of it. You can't. That life. And it also becomes a hard concept for us to understand grace and mercy, because if this is truly God, then how in the world can God look past our what we've done if we can't even forgive ourselves? I mean, I've met people who say, I don't think that God could forgive me from what I've done. And the reason that I think that comes out is because they can't even get themselves to be forgiven, or they can't even get themselves to forgive themselves. They have such a difficult time understanding that a God who understands everything from beginning to end can actually look at their past and say, it's forgiven, it's done. That's your past. And the concept of grace and forgiveness not only seems unlikely to them, it seems impossible. How can God truly forgive me for what I have done? Because every time that we look in the mirror, we understand that it's hard to try to deal with a person in front of the mirror. And even though we know the things the person in front of the mirror has done, God knows the things the person in front of the mirror was created to do. See, we see it one way, but God sees it another way. And we are good at defining ourselves by our past. We do a great job at that. We live in that. But God is in the business of redefining our past so that he could define our future, so that he could define what we are called to do. And not only is God faithful and just to forgive us of the things that we've done in the past, not only is God merciful, but he uses imperfect people to do the things that he has asked us to do, to carry out his plans, which is mind-boggling to me. That a perfect God would choose to use broken people to do things that, let's be honest, we're going to mess things up along the way, but God still chooses to use people who are imperfect to carry out his good and perfect will. And it's mind-boggling. And that's what we continue to see over and over in the Bible, which is really what we're going through in this series called Spotlight. You know, as we're looking at the different accounts in the Bible, we find that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. People like Noah, people who are ordinary but carried out God's plan. Or people like Joseph, who had a messed up family dynamic, but God used him to save the lives and the lives of many others. Or people like Moses, who was used in the exodus of the Israelites from leaving the land of Egypt, where they became enslaved in after the death of Joseph, which we spoke of last week. Last week we talked about this young man, this teenager that was sold into slavery at the age of 17. And when he was sold into slavery, God had this plan. I'm not going to recap the whole story, but we get to the end of his life where his brothers who sold him into slavery are saying, forgive us, your dad, our dad, said to be merciful. And he said, you know what you intended for bad, God used for good. And after Joseph dies, His family are living now in Egypt, and they're there for a long time. It's hundreds of years. But then a new ruler comes to place who has no idea anything about who Joseph is, what he did, or his family. And at this point, the people of Israel are multiplying. They're getting stronger. So the new Pharaoh, for fear of being overtaken and betrayed, he tries to come up with a plan so that he could suppress the Israelites, so that they won't take over or they won't betray. So what he does is he creates this plan where he is going to put them in slavery. Now they will become the slaves of the Egyptians. But the Israelites put the baby boomers to shame. When it comes to multiplying, it seems like the more that they're oppressed, the faster they begin to multiply. And they're just multiplying and becoming stronger to the point where Pharaoh now comes up with a different plan to deal with the issue. He comes up with this plan where he is going to murder every single baby boy that is born, but he is going to allow every single girl, after they are delivered, to live. Now, as we talk about this may not sound very unfamiliar because we are living in a culture right now where this is kind of happening. After delivery, in our country, in some states, you are able to abort a child. And I am not going to try to veneer this in any way. It is wicked. Abortion is a wicked act. And when we see what is happening, we see that Pharaoh is wanting to eliminate every single boy after birth, which is wicked. Because he is now deciding who is going to live and who is going to die. But he sends out this message, and for us, we're dealing with this, and it's a very real thing. Now, with that being said, I understand that everybody's story is very different, but the outcome is still the same. Abortion is wicked. And sadly enough, it's a real thing in our culture today. And the reality of it is you go to a different state, and there's different states that are trying to pass it, and it's legal. But legal in the eyes of the world doesn't equate to right in the eyes of God. Very different things. Wickedness may be executed in different ways for different purposes, but it is always evil. It is always wicked. But, Pharaoh creates this plan, and he tells the people, the midwives, he says, now you're going to get rid of every child. But the midwives refuse to give in to Pharaoh, and they refuse to do what they are being told to do. So God blesses them. So Pharaoh decides to give a different order. And this time it is going to be to get rid of every child that is born, that is a boy, and be thrown into the Nile River. They will be murdered one way or another. So there is this boy that is born during this time, and he's hidden for 3 months. But then after 3 months, he can be hidden no more. So his mom makes this basket that's waterproof, goes down by the Nile River in the reeds, puts the basket down there. And as he's there, the child is there, Pharaoh's daughter is out bathing, and she hears the child cry. As she hears the child cry, she approaches the basket, and at this point sees that it's an Israelite child, so she adopts him as her own. And because of the way that everything happened in this story, she decides to name him Moses, which sounds like a Hebrew term that means to be lifted out. And Moses' story really takes off from here. This is kind of the bare grounds of what's happening in Moses' life. But in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, in the New Testament, we're told a little bit more about what happened in Moses' life. There's a little synopsis as to what happens after he is adopted. It says that Moses was taught all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in both speech and in action. So Moses is raised as an Egyptian. Moses is raised in everything that the Egyptians are doing. And the verse continues by saying that he is raised this way, but then one day, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his relatives, the people of Israel. Now, when I was a teenager, this verse would have had a totally different context as to how I would see it. Now as I see 40 years old, it's different. When I was growing up, 40 years old sounded like the guy was about to kick the bucket, But now that I'm 34, I'm looking at this and I'm like, he's actually pretty young, A totally different way of viewing it. But as I see this, Moses, there has been some time that has elapsed in his life. And at this point, something significant is about to happen. At the age of 40, this is what it's giving us, but in the book of Exodus, it picks up the story, and it's telling us what happens in this period. Many years later, which once again we learned about it in the book of Acts, 40 years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Not a very great family visit. They typically don't end very good anyways. But, he goes and visits his family, and it's not the greatest one. Moses goes into this situation, and unfortunately, he commits murder. I mean, we understand that that's going to alter the life of a person. And he tries to hide it, just like we try to hide our sin, whatever it is. And understand that no matter what sin you have in your life, it's wrong in the eyes of God. Whether it's murder or adultery, they're both sin. And they are seen as punishable by law by God. But I am going to guess that most people might not be able to relate in Moses' sin. We might not be able to relate as to what he did. But I'm going to assume that 100% of us can actually relate in his actions following his sin, and that is trying to hide it. When we sin, we do the very same thing. We try to hide it from the people that we love, from those that love us, that care for us, that want to see the best in us, from God who created us, who is merciful, who extends grace. We seclude ourselves and we try to hide those. Which, once again, I'm a human being. I do the same things when I sin, right? And we do it for a couple of reasons. One is guilt. We feel guilty about what we've done, which is a great thing. That's what actually brings about the morality in us, that we feel guilty when we're doing something that goes against the will of God. But there is also this fear of consequence. We understand that there is going to be a consequence for our actions. And the last thing that might actually move us to that is fear of rejection. What if the people that say that they care about me and love me will reject me for what I did? And, the reality of it is if you do anything that goes against the law, there is a consequence for it. But that doesn't mean that God is not able to forgive you. There is a consequence on earth because we understand that there has been a system set up that is here to protect its citizens. And there is going to be a punishment, but that doesn't mean that God is not able to forgive us of the sins that we've committed. And there might be fear of rejection from people. That doesn't mean that God will reject you. I am telling you that whatever it is that creates this fear, God can take it away and is faithful and just to forgive us of our past. Because there is no sin in your past that is too great that God can't forgive. There is no sin too great in your past that will push God away from you. And there is no sin too great that can prevent God from using you. Nothing that you've done will prevent God. Your past will never limit God's grace and purpose. It's never going to limit it. God's not going to say, well, that's way too much. I don't know that I could deal with it. Although that's how we see it in our mind, that's not the way that God works. God doesn't say there's a limit to my grace. God's grace is freely given no matter what you've done in your past. Now, when we talk about what we're engaging in, that's a totally different story, but I'm not going there today. We're talking about the fact that God's grace is limitless to what we've done in the past. And sometimes we're scared of it because we just see the mess. And when we have messes in our lives, sometimes it's difficult for us to understand how it could actually get better. A few weeks back, our vehicle started making some noises. It was during the cold spell that we had, and I grew up in Texas, so this is just like weird to me, with how cold it got. And I know that it's not necessarily typical. I've lived in Minnesota and the northern states for a little bit longer than I've lived anywhere else, so I know that it's not typical. But it was during that cold weather that we had our vehicle create some issues. And it sounded expensive. We all understand when those sounds come about and you're like, this doesn't sound good. We know that there's something wrong. And I don't know much about mechanics. I know very little about mechanics, but I know that we can put up with the light that says check engine for a long time. It's okay, that's normal. But when it starts flashing, you know that it's into a different category. You know that there's something wrong and you have to stop and try to pay attention to this. So I knew that it didn't only sound expensive, it looked expensive. So I was here at church, and Mike Klenke, who was part of our gathering, he was here, and we started talking about the issues with the vehicle. Now, he's very knowledgeable and experienced when it comes to cars, so I knew I was talking to the right person about this, and he offered to take a look at it. He said I could check out to see what's going on. But the vehicle sounded like a lost cause to me. It sounded terrible. It sounded like I was driving a semi. The semi drivers are probably thinking, that sounds great. But the vehicle sounded pretty rough, in rough shape. And as Mike looked at it, he had a similar diagnosis. It didn't sound good, and it did sound expensive. But Mike said that he would look at it and, try to work on it, which is great because the vehicle ended up in the condition that it was in at my hands. And it wasn't a great condition. So to have somebody that knows what they're doing and has an idea on how to fix it was a great thing for me. So a few days happened after we had talked, and he actually ended up giving us back the vehicle in working condition, which was great, but it was because it ended up in the right hands. See, in my hands, all that I could see was junk. All that I could see is, I think I need a new vehicle, which was kind of reaffirmed by some people. It sounds like you need a new vehicle. But when I was looking at it, I was looking at it through the lens of what I could do on my own effort. And unfortunately for some of us, when we look in the mirror, we see the mess that we've created. We see our past, and we're like, there's no way that anything is good in this. There's no way that it could be fixed. We see our relationships that are broken. We see our addictions that we are just entangling and enslaving us. And we're like, there's no way that anything good can come out of this situation. And I think because when we get to that point, we're afraid to give it over to God or to give it to somebody that can help us and keep us accountable. We try to hide it. We try to hide it, and it becomes our secret sin that most of us deal with, but yet we don't acknowledge. But understand that if you try to hide it, you don't have to continue to hide it from God. And maybe you try to hide it, and now it's out in the open. Everybody knows what you've done, and it's humiliating. And you just feel like there is no moving forward from here. But I'm telling you that there is nothing that we have done in the past that can limit God from using us. Just like it didn't limit God from using Moses. Because Moses' secret didn't stay buried. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid, thinking, everybody knows what I did. His secret is out. And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. So Moses decides to run away, which I don't think any of us are surprised by that, because whenever our sin is out, we try to seclude ourselves from the people that are trying to help us, that care for us. And the reality is that we can run away from our, but you're not running away from your problem. Your problem doesn't stay wherever you ran from. It goes right along with you. So if you have issues with family, that's going to continue to follow you wherever you go. It didn't stay where you ran from. If you need an attitude adjustment, it didn't stay wherever you left it. It's following you every single step of the way. Everything that we run from, the sin that we're trying to hide, and we're trying to portray this beautiful, glamorous, marvelous life to everybody else, that's not what you are actually having. You're leaving everything. You think that you're leaving everything behind, but you're not. It's following you wherever you go. And the reality is that you can run away from the environment, but you can't run away from the problem. If it's your past, it's different. But it's still part of your story. When it comes to our past, I think the issue is that we sometimes don't want it to be part of our story. We want it to stay far away from us. And yes, we understand that Scripture tells us that our sins are separated as far as the east is from the west. So we understand that. But that doesn't mean that they're not part of our story. Just like my past is still part of my story. If you've heard my past, you understand I don't try to hide my past. Even though I'm not proud of it, I understand that it's still part of my story and it's still part of God's grace. That God can use something broken and mend it full. But our lives don't have to be defined by our past. But I do want to clarify, because there are so many words or so many phrases that are culture abuses that it's just annoying. I mean, realistically, I'm just being honest. It's just annoying. And one of them is, that's my past. And that might be the case. That might be the case. Once again, for me, it is my past. But our life is only defined by our past if the past is not part of our present. If you're still bringing the past into what you're doing right now, I'm sorry, that's not the past. That's what you're doing currently. You cannot say that's part of your past when you're still engaging in that lifestyle. We are called to leave everything behind. And we understand that we mess things up. There's a lot of things that I'm not proud of. Yet, I don't make any bones about it. I'm willing to tell you the things that I did. But I'm not doing them now. And I'm not perfect. I still fail. But at the same time, I'm not going to try to hide those either. Because I know it elevates the grace of God. That he still chooses to love me. Even in the midst of my failures. But sometimes we run away. And we just want to start this new life. We want to start fresh. Which is a great thing. We like fresh starts. But Moses is just the same thing. He leaves a situation undealt with, and he just runs away to the land of Midian. And as he arrives there, he actually finds a wife. He marries her. They have a child who they call Gershom, which sounds like a Hebrew term, which means a foreigner here or a foreigner there. So he understands that that's not his place of residence. It's not his place of living. And for most of us, even though we're trying to start a new identity, we understand that that's not really us, right? We see ourselves in the mirror. But during his time there, he starts a new life. He starts working for his father-in-law, and he's tending the flock one day, and he's by Sinai, which is the mountain of God. And as he's there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Do not come any closer, the Lord warned. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. See, Moses had committed a terrible sin. So he decides to run away. But the beauty of this is that it doesn't matter how far we run. It doesn't matter where you run to or what you ran from. God still meets us in our brokenness. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter how far you think you've gone from grace. God still comes and meets Moses where he's at. And maybe you started by running away from people, but maybe now you find yourself running away from God. We all end up in a scenario where it's hard for us. We don't like accountability. We don't like to be reminded of the things that we've done, but we have to deal with the issues. And there's this fear. Well, what if what I've been trying to hide comes to light and everybody finds out? And is God really able to forgive something as severe as whatever it is? God is able to forgive the murderer just as he is able to forgive the adulterer, and vice versa, and every other sin that is labeled in the Bible. It doesn't matter what you ran from, where you ran to, God can meet you there. And even in the midst of our failures that seem too big for God to deal with, not only does God extend mercy, not only does God extend grace, but when he meets us there, at times the most difficult part is that he calls us not only to a higher standard, but calls us to do something. And that scares us, right? Because church should be a place where you just come, you just enjoy what's going on, you enjoy the fellowship of other people, but we don't necessarily want to do what God is calling us to do. But when God meets us, and there's this brokenness that he changes, he calls us to something greater. And when we feel like God's grace is difficult enough to try to get to, how much more difficult is it to accept God's calling? That maybe God is going to call us to do something greater. And sometimes our past isn't very appealing, that we just refuse. We don't want to do whatever God is calling us to do because there's better people that are qualified, right? There's a person that is like the Brady Bunch, and those people are great. Those people are the ones that are called to do whatever it is that God is calling them to do because they don't have a past like mine. No, God uses broken people over and over again. And sometimes we're trying to hide our story. And what if God is calling us to go back? What if God calls us to go to the place that we've tried to run from and hide things? How many times do we understand that our story could actually be used for the building of the kingdom of God? What we've gone through. What if going back to what we're trying to hide, when it comes to light, What if that's what saves the lives of many people? God doesn't use perfect people. God uses imperfect people as part of his story. And at times we're terrified to go back and to do what God is calling us to do. So we try to come up with excuses. No, it's way too big of an issue to bring up. It's way too big of a sin that people would be willing to listen to anything I have to say. Which is exactly what Moses does, So he's hidden his sin. He's ran away, but now God is calling him to go back. And he tries to come up with every excuse, just like we would. Exodus chapter 4, verse 1, Moses protested again and said, what if they don't believe me or listen to me? So God is telling him to go back to his people. And he's saying, what if they don't listen to me or believe me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you? How many times do we sound like Moses when it comes to our relationships or conversations with people? What if I bring it up and they say that I'm just crazy, that God never told me to do that? What if they don't believe what I have to say? What if they don't accept what I'm telling them? And we sound like Moses, because we're like, hey, my past is sketchy. Why would God want to use somebody like me? Why would anybody listen to what I have to say? And God gives miraculous signs for Moses to perform so that the people will believe. But you would assume that this would be great. Okay, that's great. I have a staff that turns into a snake. I could put my hand into my cloak and it turns into leprosy, and then I put it back in and it's gone. Most of us would probably say, that's good enough. I'll take that. Let's be honest. It's not good enough. Because when we're hesitant to do what God has called us to do, we'll use every excuse in the book. So in verse 10, he goes on by saying, Moses pleaded with the Lord, "Oh Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been, and I'm not now. Even though you have spoken to me, I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled." So now Moses is saying, I'm not very good with words. I don't know that I can. How many times does God call us to talk to our neighbors about Jesus, but it's like, I'm not a preacher. I don't know what I'm saying. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. That's not something that God called me to do. And we're looking for every excuse as to why not to say it. Which Acts 7:22 actually confirms for us that Moses was actually powerful in both speech and in action. So it's not that he was unqualified, but of course we're going to use every excuse that we can to try to come up with it. So the Lord reassures him, hey, you know what? I'm the one that fashioned the mouth. I'm the one that makes the deaf speak, the deaf hear and the mute speak. And once again, God calls people. He doesn't call those who are equipped. He equips the called. And then in Acts chapter 4:13, still not good enough, Moses again pleaded, Lord, please send anyone else. Just send someone else, not me. See, the thing is that God doesn't use perfect people to carry out his plan. He uses imperfect people who are willing to do what God is calling them to do. God's purpose is not limited by our ability. God's grace is not limited by our standards. Our past will never limit what God can do. God's purpose for your life is not limited by your excuses or your inability. See, it doesn't matter what excuse you have. God can work through that. It doesn't matter what you think you can't do. God can empower you to do those things. And God uses a murderer to deliver his people from Egypt. Moses goes back to Egypt, and God uses miraculous signs and wonders to deliver the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Moses becomes the man who leads the Israelites out of Egypt and parts the Red Sea, which most of us are familiar with that part of the story. The man who receives the Ten Commandments. The man who saw the Lord's glory at Mount Sinai. The man who saw his people that were oppressed, but was the man that was used for their deliverance. What you can and can't do, what you have or have not done, will not limit what God is able to do. God is able to do the impossible, not because you're going to limit him, but because he is limitless. He doesn't have any boundaries. God not only uses Moses to deliver the people of Israel, but he uses them in a great and mighty way. Moses becomes the writer of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible in the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Moses becomes the writer. See, God is not limited by our past. God's grace does not have a limit. No distance is too great that God can't meet you there. There is no excuse too great or inability too crippling that will prevent God from using you. We just have to be willing to go wherever he calls us to and allow him to chisel out anything that doesn't belong, our past, to chisel that away so that we could start looking more and more like Christ every single day. Lives that are no longer defined by our past, but by what God is doing in our present. Those are the lives that really highlight who God is in our midst and in our lives. Let's pray.